Hi, I'm Farah Halime, and today I'm introducing The Illuminator, Art, Conspiracy and Madness, a new podcast coming from Brazen. The Illuminator is a story of an artist called Mark Lombardi. But Mark was in fact an investigator just as much as he was an artist. Today I'm joined by Lawrence Rinder, an art curator and museum director. Lawrence worked at the Whitney Museum when it bought a number of Mark's drawings relating to one of the biggest financial scandals of our time, the collapse of a bank called BCCI. And just a quick note before we get started, you might hear Lawrence's dog during our conversation. Thanks very much for joining us, Lawrence. It's great to speak to you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I thought we'd start with this work of Mark Lombardi's, the big piece of work, the BCCI. Can you actually talk me through the piece itself and how you went about acquiring it?
Sure. Well, this was the last major piece that Mark made before he died, and he finished it in 2000. I think he was working on it for about 4 years, from 1996 to 2000. It's an enormous piece. People who know Claude Monet's Water Lilies, or a Jackson Pollock drip painting. It has that kind of scale and presence. I moved to New York in 2000 to work at the Whitney Museum as the curator of contemporary art. And I must have seen this piece in an exhibition. To be honest, I don't remember when I first saw it, but it probably was in 2000, shortly after I came to New York. And I was very impressed with it and, loved it and recognized immediately that this was not only a great work of art, but the tip of an iceberg of incredible and very unusual talent. I think the work is visually and in a way, methodologically, unlike anything else that I had seen before or knew of. And even though Mark at that time was not well known, I thought it was important for the Whitney to sort of, for lack of a better word, take a chance and get this monumental piece. So luckily, my committee agreed, and we were able to get the work. So the work, I'm very happy to say, is now in the collection of the Whitney Museum. And the piece, as you know, and the listeners may also know, documents a very extensive and extraordinary banking scandal that took place for over several decades in the 70s, 80s, and maybe even into the 90s with a bank called BCCI. And they got tangled up in all kinds of seedy money laundering scandals that not only involved the Afghan mujahideen and drug traffickers, but also extended into some fairly mainstream American and other political environments. And as you can see in Mark's piece, there are names like George Bush on there that are kind of surprising to see in the context of such a seedy scandal, or perhaps not surprising.
I read one of your very early articles in the Village Voice, and you were talking about the incident of the FBI calling the Whitney. Can you tell me a little bit about how you felt when they called the museum and your response?
Yeah. So, Mark's work documents these sort of extensive networks, or you could use the word conspiracy, I guess, related to finance, terrorism, politics. And the work involved a tremendous amount of research. The FBI did contact the museum in 2001. I believe some agents actually came to the museum. I was not there at the time. I came in, and I think one of my assistants said, "Oh, you missed the FBI, they were here." And so it was just not the sort of thing that happens every day. So it was amusing in the sense that, well, that's weird. Why would the FBI want to look at, a work of art in our collection? But you have to remember that this incident occurred within less than 2 months after the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center. I lived in Lower Manhattan. There was no traffic downtown. You could still smell the aftermath of the event. And you can imagine it was a horrific thing that was still very much real and alive at that moment. Not only the physical reality of the smell in the air, the and the posters that were everywhere, still all over the city, because in the aftermath, people had put up photographs of the folks who had died in the hope that someone would recognize them and say, well, they're alive after all. And there were also American flags everywhere, all over the city. It was a very, very strange time. It was surreal, and you felt there that a sense of fear and foreboding and bordering on paranoia. So that was the context of the FBI coming to the museum to look at this work of art. It underscored all those feelings and made concrete the sense that nothing was as it should be, that the world was upside down, the FBI was interested in art. It was just like, oh, here's another crazy thing going on. I think the seriousness of it probably set in, like, well, what is it in this artwork that they're interested in, and is there something there that is important and tells a story that is of consequence to the national security.
And what's interesting about that particular work and all of his works as taken together is that he never concludes anything. He just merely displays them without any judgment. Why do you think that the FBI was interested in a piece of work that seemed so elusive?
I'm sure they weren't interested in it because of its elusiveness. The FBI doesn't care about aesthetics or, the charm of the incomplete and all that sort of stuff. I think to the extent that they were interested in it, I would imagine it was because underlying his work, however elusive it might ultimately be, was a tremendous amount of actual research. He was a trained researcher and a trained archivist, and he knew how to do this work, which was, I believe that was in advance of the internet, or at least the internet as we know it. So it was really kind of hard slogging, checking, probably in archives, newspaper records, God knows how he did it. But he kept notes on file cards. It was really old school sleuthing. And then he used that information to make art. The FBI was probably grasping for straws. So I don't think they were looking for his conclusions so much as maybe some random name that maybe would show up there that they hadn't thought of. That's my guess, but I don't really know.
Did you look at the work differently in the aftermath of 9/11 and after, when you had first procured the artwork compared to post 9/11? Was there a different point of view on the work from you?
I mean, I guess to the extent that it suddenly felt tremendously and immediately relevant in a real world sense. The idea that this work of art potentially possessed something meaningful related to that powerful incident made the work feel somehow, this is overstating it, but radioactive, like it suddenly became alive with a kind of an energy that it had before, but maybe not at that volume.
Wow, that's fascinating. I just wanted to sort of conclude by asking you whether you, in the years since his death, and whether people talk to you about Mark Lombardi, whether his name comes up and what scenarios.
I mean, I think his work and his name is still, very relevant out there in the art world and timely. And were it to be shown, today, I think people would feel instinctively the connections to the kind of conspiratorial mentality that is really, afoot these days and is not just background noise or incidental or some kind of sort of weird anomaly. It's actually underlying sort of one of the main political parties of our country and motivating the voters of a good part of the electorate of the United States. So this way of thinking has, if anything, only become more relevant and part of our lives. And so I think Mark Lombardi's methodology, the inspiration for the work remains extremely relevant.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Lawrence, for joining us.
My pleasure.
The Illuminator is out Monday, November 11th. Make sure you subscribe. For early releases, ad-free listening, and to support what we do here at Brazen, head to brazen.fm/plus. And in case you haven't already heard it, here's the trailer. Thanks for listening.
I'm real pleased you could come by and take a look at this work.
I want to tell you a story.
What do I have to show?
A story with some
Dark passages to it.
about a man named Mark Lombardi,
It's all public information. I am just reprocessing it.
a brilliant creator who was at once conceptual artist and investigative reporter.
I am rearranging it in a visual format that's meaningful to me.
His finger was on the pulse of the biggest stories of our time.
He knew how to dig into things.
Mark was political in his own way. He wasn't a journalist, even though he used the techniques of journalistic research.
Corruption and international intrigue. Mark's art charted troubling connections between the White House, Saudi Arabia, and dramatic events that would shape foreign policy
We
forever.
believe that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
A galaxy of connections, all marked out in elegant drawings.
Those drawings are really beautiful. Nobody was making art like this, and they still haven't.
But the more disturbing connections he makes about the world, the more he begins to feel like he's being watched. Someone is surveilling him and his creations.
And there was some police standing at the curb.
Because Mark's art is illuminating conspiracies
I went out to a side street and I cried.
until his death becomes one.
I just knew he was dead.
He had a card that he would hand out that would say, death-defying acts of art and conspiracy.
I remember telling him, "Aren't you afraid for your life?"
This is the journey of Mark Lombardi's life, how he rose from humble beginnings to become a groundbreaking artist who left behind an untold legacy, trailblazing a path for whistleblowers like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden.
Think anybody's gonna come along and shoot you in the back of the skull tonight?
Actually, I'll tell you, I have been asked that question before.
The Illuminator, Art, Conspiracy, and Madness. The story of a conceptual artist's rise to fame, whose brilliant genius had devastating consequences. From Brazen, coming November 11th, wherever you get your podcasts.